Okay, so good to have a break, a drink, a biscuit. So if we could have the slides up. So I want to talk about the subject of biology and the Bible, fearfully and wonderfully made. And I'm sure you're familiar with the passage in the scriptures, in the Psalms. It says, "I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, I know that full well." You know, and I have an Australian version of the Bible at home, and it translates that last phrase, it's flippin' obvious. I know that full well. You see, it is obvious that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And I want to share a quote with you from a man called Dan Brown, whom some of you may have heard of. He was the author of the Da Vinci Code, which was they made it into a movie, and it was a book. Anyone ever see that movie? It was a fast, action-packed thing, and he wrote a number of books. They're all generally pretty much anti-Christian kind of books. But he was interviewed, and he said this: "I was raised Episcopalian, that's sort of the equivalent of Anglican, I guess, in the US, and I was very religious as a kid. Then in 8th or 9th grade, I studied astronomy, cosmology, and the origins of the universe. I remember saying to a minister, 'I don't get it. I read a book that said there was an explosion known as the Big Bang. But here it says that God created the heaven and the earth in 7 days. Which is right?' So 8th or 9th grade, that would put him somewhere in his middle teens, I guess, and he's heard about the evolutionary story. But he was very religious as a kid, remember? So he's brought up in the church. Often people say to me, 'This is all very interesting, the stuff you're doing, but my kids are fine. We're bringing them up in the church,' unaware that they may be taken out later on by all of the evolutionary establishment and all the indoctrination which goes on in our education system. So it's very important that we raise children to not only believe that the Bible is true, but raise them to be able to defend that it's true. You must be able to give answers. As it says in 1 Peter 3:15, which I shared yesterday, always be prepared to give an answer. Tremendously important. We need our heads in step with our hearts. So if a young Dan Brown came to you and asked that question, what would you say? Would you be able to give him an answer? See, some people say to me, "But this issue of origins doesn't matter to me, I don't care." Well, it may not be an issue for you, but if Dan Brown came to you and asked you that question as a young teenager, what would you say to him? Well, let's see what his minister said. Unfortunately, the response I got was, "Nice boys don't ask that question." Not very helpful. Very sad, in fact. And what happened? A light went off. And I said, "The Bible doesn't make sense. Science makes much more sense to me." And I just gravitated away from religion. Can you see how important it is that we are prepared to give an answer? That's why this material that we're sharing on this weekend is so important. And there it is. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And that's what the ministry of Creation Ministries International is about. And I've shared with you, I should apologise for the repetition of these slides, but often these talks are just given standalone, so you get a reminder frequently. Don't forget the website. Remember, creation.com. Couldn't be easier, could it? Now, remember last night I talked about the two different sorts of science, and I explained what experimental science was and what historical science was, and we talked about it again in the last talk. And remember the summary: science studies the repeatable, but history studies the unrepeatable. So we need a history book. Now, this whole issue, a trustworthy history book, right? And here it is, God's Word. This whole issue is often presented as a conflict between God and science. In fact, that was the front page of Time magazine some years ago. But I'd suggest to you it's actually not that, and I want to share with you a quotation from Professor Richard Lewontin, who is a very famous evolutionary biologist, and he said, "We take the side of science," and I put in brackets there, evolutionary science, "in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, because we have a prior commitment to materialism." Now, I've called it naturalism, looking for natural explanations, but materialism is a related concept, right? It's basically saying the material universe is all that exists. There is no spiritual dimension, there's no God, none of that stuff. We do it all by what we can see, feel, touch, taste, and so on. But then he went on and said, "Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." So he just gave away the game, didn't he? He's actually taking a religious position. So it's not science versus faith at all. It's actually faith versus faith. His faith in secularism, that there is no God, atheism if you will, versus the Christian faith that there's a God of the Bible. And there was a sign next to a US freeway that said, "Praise Darwin, evolve beyond belief." And it was put up there by the Freedom from Religion Foundation. But I thought it was rather strange because if you look at it, it's all very elaborate. It looks like one of those highly illustrated old Bibles, doesn't it? Very religious indeed. But you see, evolution is actually a religion. Now, sometimes the evolutionists themselves, in a moment of honesty, recognise that. And this guy, Professor Michael Ruse, is a philosopher. And he gets it, even though he's an evolutionist. He says evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and morality. Isn't that interesting? Evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning, and it's true of evolution still today. But the Bible says we are fearfully and wonderfully made. So therefore, in the discipline of biology, we should see abundant evidence of God's brilliant creative genius, and we do. If we were to take a single cell and just to look at it in its staggering complexity, we would find an amazing array of technology, if you like. I want to quote from a man called Michael Denton, who wrote these words. He was not a Christian at the time. I don't know if he is yet, but he was a professor of biology at the time. And he said, "To grasp the reality of life as it has been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it's 20 kilometres in diameter and resembles a giant airship large enough to cover a great city like London or New York. What we would then see would be an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design." Isn't that interesting? Things that are designed need a designer, don't they? We would find ourselves in a world of supreme technology and bewildering complexity. So inside the living cell are countless many different machines that perform absolutely extraordinary functions with amazing efficiency. And inside the cell, for instance, there's a little transport system called a motor kinesin. And this little guy has a job to do, and that's to transport proteins from one part of the cell to another, or even to outside of the cell, where the protein is delivered to fulfill whatever purpose it has intended. So with the aid of some very clever technology, looking at things like electron microscopes and other technology, scientists have been able to image what these machines actually look like. So what I want to play for you now is a video clip of an animation of this little motor kinesin. And he marches along carrying this sack of proteins, and he's really quite remarkable.
Inside a living cell is an amazing transportation system. Proteins have to be delivered to the correct part of the cell to perform their intended functions. This animation, based on a lot of clever research over a number of years, shows how it happens. Highways made of microtubules are assembled by interlocking proteins, each manufactured in accordance with the coded instructions on the cell's DNA. Marching along a microtubule is the kinesin motor, the hero of our story, carrying a huge sack of proteins to be delivered to a predetermined place in the cell. Here, the proteins will be released to fulfill their functions. A kinesin linear motor uses 1 ATP to provide the energy for each step and takes 125,000 steps to cover 1 millimetre. This amazing machine shows all the hallmarks of design.
What a crazy little guy. Now, I'm not too sure about the dance at the end. But that's what he looks like. Isn't that amazing? And the thing he walks on is assembled in front of him and then disassembled behind him. All in accordance with the programmed instructions written onto the DNA embedded inside that single cell. Absolutely extraordinary. How people think that came about by chance blows me away. And here's Professor Paul Davies, an Australian scientist, not a Christian, who says nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organise themselves into the first living cell. How did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? You see, it's not so much the hardware that matters inside the cell, the machines, it's the software that controls them, which is absolutely mind-boggling. Now, software is all about information. Now, if you want to make something complex, you need to have information. Like this building that we are in didn't come about because of an explosion in a Bunnings warehouse, right? It was obviously designed. People came along with the raw materials and assembled it and so on. So we need to have plans, instructions, and the same is true, in fact, of living organisms. So information specifies living things. Now, if you wanted to make a single-celled bacterium, you can imagine all the assembly instructions written down that would fill something like a 500-page book. Quite a sizable amount of information to make just a single-celled bacterium. But what if we wanted to make a more complex creature like a horse? Well, now you need instructions for making bones, muscles, heart, lungs, hair, eyes, the list goes on and on. You mean piles and piles of books, more information, full of information. So the problem for the naturalistic explanation for the origin of life and for the development of life is where does all the extra information come from to progress from a simple organism to a complex organism? Now, all that information is stored in this amazing molecule, which is actually the densest information storage system in the entire universe, the DNA molecule. And, just in one molecule of human DNA, there's enough information to fill 1,000 encyclopedia books full of information. Now, I once talked about an encyclopedia to a youth group and they all looked blankly at me until I said, well, an encyclopedia is like a printed version of Wikipedia, and then they got it. Well, where does all that information come from? Now, let's think about information itself and what is it and how is it transmitted. So I'm standing here talking to you and I have a thought that arises in my mind. So I encode that thought by some means or other. Now, because I'm speaking in English, I think in English, and so I will encode it as an English sentence. But that means if I wrote it down, I'd have to observe the rules of spelling and grammar, and if I'm speaking, I just have to observe the rules of pronunciation and grammar. And then I transmit that message to you. Now, at the moment, I'm doing it verbally by speaking, but also you're reading things up on the screen. So whatever the means of transmission is, now you receive that and you decode the information that you've received. But you can't decode it unless you too have the same pre-existing code. You must understand English and its rules of spelling and of grammar. And if you correctly decode it, then that information arises in your mind. And hopefully, if we've managed that process correctly, then what originated in my mind ends up in yours. Now, there's lots of opportunity for things to go wrong on the way through, and often stuff does, and that's often the raw material for lots of comedy sketches and so on. But let's think about this, having this predetermined code. Now, if I take these 4 letters In English, that conjures up in my mind immediately something like this. Something with a bow on it, a gift. Someone's giving me a gift. But let's imagine that I spoke German. Does anybody know what GIFT means in German? Anyone? No? It means poison. Now, after the Second World War, German postal workers were very reluctant to handle parcels with GIFT on them from England until they realised that it's okay, this means it's a gift, right? How about these 4 letters? Now, to me, that conjures up a picture of a casual conversation over a cup of coffee. But what if I was French? Does anyone know what CHAT means in French? Yeah? No one? It means a cat. So if you've got the wrong code, you can't communicate. But the thing is, you've got to have that code before you even begin to communicate. Now, the code, I can't give you a kilogram of English, right? It's non-material. It's not something that you can put on some scales and weigh. It's conceptual. Why people adhere to materialism beats me. So, for instance, can information arise by chance? And remember, this is what the naturalistic explanations require. Chance processes, unguided. They can't be guided because if they're guided, you've just invented a god, right? So they're unguided random processes have to lead from simple organisms becoming complex. So has anyone ever heard of alphabet soup? You know what alphabet soup is? When I was growing up, we used to have alphabet soup. It had the little pasta pieces that were made in the letters of the alphabet. This was just fun for kids to, dip your spoon in. Let's imagine you dipped your spoon into alphabet soup and this came up. Would you believe that that could happen by chance? No, of course not. Now, you can actually calculate the probability that that might have happened by chance. And it turns out that it would have been the same as guessing an 18-digit PIN. That's getting 18 numbers in a row correct in one shot. Now, if you think about that, you realise that's staggeringly unlikely. And all that is just a simple phrase, are you happy? You see, the information encoded on our DNA is massively more complex than that. And there is no way it can arise through random processes. Professor Werner Gitt was a world-famous information scientist, and he formulated a number of theorems actually. And one was this: no information can exist without an initial mental source. That is, information is by nature a mental and not a material quantity. Or, phrasing it another way, information comes from an intelligence. So if there's any information around, like coded instructions on DNA, they came from an intelligence. Now that's a secular theorem, right? That's not quoting a Bible verse or anything like that. And he went on and said, no information can exist in purely statistical processes, which translated means information cannot arise by chance. So the evolutionist has a problem trying to figure out how the information arises. Now, Darwin put forward the view that the mechanism for going from a simple organism to a complex one was natural selection. And so if there was some random change in an organism that somehow or other gave it a beneficial characteristic, then it would be selected for, it would reproduce more, and that would then become the dominant population, and that's how we progress from simple to complex. So let's have a look at how natural selection works. Unfortunately, our science courses tend to equate evolution with natural selection. And in fact, we have a little leaflet up the back there, which, if Jen, I'm wondering if you can find it, just wave it around. The one with the dog on the front, I think, which says natural selection is not evolution. We haven't got that one. All right, sorry, take that back. You can find it on the website. So let's have a look at how natural selection works. So come on a bit of a thought experiment with me. These two creatures are dogs, all right? That's a big step, I know, but let's imagine they are. And they have medium length hair. And the reason they have medium length hair is because, let's assume, that only 2 genes determine the hair length. It's actually more complex than that, but that'll do for the purpose of argument. One gene makes short hair, the other makes long hair. Now, let's imagine that they get a long and a short-haired gene from each of their parents. Therefore, they have medium-length hair. Now, we can produce some puppies from these two, and the first little guy, he gets the short-haired gene from each of his parents. So he's got very short hair. The next two, they're like their parents. They get a long-haired gene and a short-haired gene. So they have medium-length hair. And this little guy, he gets the jackpot because he gets the long-haired gene from each of his parents. So he's got very long hair, and there he is, hairy little dog. Now let's imagine that they move to a cold climate, and what will happen is that the short and medium-length haired dogs will be selected against by the environment. But the long-haired ones, they'll be fine, they'll be warm, not a problem. And if those two fall in love and produce a bunch of puppies, then guess what? Every single one of them will have long hair. But can you see what's actually happened here? You see, the information for making short and medium-length hair has been lost from the population. You can breed those dogs as much as you like, you will never get a short-haired dog, because the information for making short hair is gone. It's not in the gene pool. So natural selection actually reduces information. And if you think about it, the name selection tells you, because you select from pre-existing information, which means you leave some behind. So it must be that you're getting less with each progressive generation. Now, what that means is that natural selection just doesn't work. And I thought I had a clip in there to play you on that, but it appears I don't. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so natural selection doesn't cut it. So then the naturalists came up with this idea. Maybe it's mutations. Now, what happens with a mutation is like a copying mistake. So if in the coded instructions in the DNA you have a random copying error, maybe that bestows an advantage on that organism, and perhaps that is the engine by which things move from simple to complex. Well, can mutations add information? So here we have Carl Sagan, a very famous atheist and biologist and professor, said mutations occur at random and are almost uniformly harmful. It is rare that a precision machine is improved by a random change in the instructions for making it. And I'm sure you all know that intuitively. If you were to make random changes to the instructions of making something in a factory, you're not going to get a better product out of the factory door. All right? So mutations are copying mistakes. You imagine taking this simple sentence and making some careless errors. Have I added information to it? Well, of course not. Errors almost always delete or corrupt information. And certainly you can't rely on random copying errors to produce the encyclopedic quantities of information needed to go from simple to complex organisms. Now here's an example of a mutation which has caused the instructions for making feathers to be switched off. So this little rooster has no feathers. Now if you're the chook farmer, you'd think this was a brilliant mutation because now you don't have to pluck the chooks, right? This is great. But if you're the little chook, you probably wouldn't agree because you're going to be very cold in winter and you're going to get sunburnt in summer, right? But the point here is there's nothing new has happened. This represents a loss of information. Now, it actually has, and I should just summarise that by saying mutations break things, they don't make things. All right? Mutations go downhill. They're deleterious, if you want a complicated word. Now, this has got a technical name. It's called the TNR mutant, which stands for totally naked rooster. It actually does, in case you didn't believe me. So mutations don't cut it either. They don't produce novel information. So does anybody know what is the third method that secular biologists now propose for generating novel information through random processes? Anybody? There isn't one. They've got no idea. There is no practical, viable model that produces information from nothing. Now, do they admit that? Well, no, they don't. And so in our biology courses, we still hear about mutations and natural selection, and they just gloss over it. But there is no mechanism. Professor Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most famous advocate for evolution and anti-Christian around, he was asked this question in our documentary From a Frog to a Prince. You can find that on our website. Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome? Right, now remember, this is it's the fundamental mechanism for the secular view of biological evolution. So surely the world champion must be able to produce any number of examples. Well, let's listen to his response.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
I think that silence was very eloquent, wasn't it? In fact, it was worse than that. It went on for about 20 seconds, and then he asked for the cameras to be stopped, and then he came back on and answered a question other than what was asked. And you can find all that on the documentary From a Frog to a Prince. So Professor Dawkins was once asked, has evolution ever been observed? And he said, evolution has been observed, it's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. I'll let you think about that. I don't think that's a very good answer. But in fairness to him, what he means is evolution is so slow you can't see it happen in any one lifetime. But that isn't true either, because scientists are regularly surprised by the rapidity with which things adapt and change to changing environments. So back to Professor Paul Davies again. Like a supercomputer, life is an information processing system. It is the software of the living cell that is the real mystery, not the hardware. And he goes on and says, there is no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. So he lays it out there. We need a new law of physics to be able to explain naturalistic evolution. But you won't hear your biology teacher telling you that at high school or lecturer at university. It's just presented as though, well, there are still a few bits and pieces here we don't fully understand, but they're research projects. But broadly, this is how it happens. But there's no evidence that supports it at all. Back in 1953, two scientists, Miller and Onnuri, conducted an experiment that presumably demonstrated that the basic building blocks of life could come about through random processes in the early Earth. And so they constructed this apparatus here, and in this diagram it shows what was there. It had an atmosphere of methane, ammonia and hydrogen, and a spark was released in that chamber at the top, and that was supposed to simulate a lightning strike or something in the early atmosphere. And then there was a device down the bottom there which they could use to trap any products that were formed. Now, interestingly, there was no oxygen in that atmosphere. And there's a reason for that, because oxygen prevents amino acids from forming. By the way, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Proteins are just strings of amino acids plugged together and then folded into particular shapes. And oxygen prevents them from forming, and if any are around, then the presence of oxygen will destroy the amino acid. But if the early Earth's atmosphere had no oxygen, it means it had no ozone layer. And the ozone layer protects the Earth from dangerous and destructive ultraviolet. And that would have destroyed any amino acids that would have formed. So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Well, and also they had a special trap to try and remove the amino acids from the environment. which is a bit hard to imagine in the early Earth. So did it work? Well, it sort of did, but not really. Yes, they produced amino acids, but they were produced in tiny traces and were grossly contaminated. And most importantly, they were what's called racemic. That is, they had an equal mix of right and left-handed molecules. Now, amino acids are like our hands. So our hands are mirror images one of the other. Now, the chemical and physical properties of a right-handed or left-handed amino acid are identical, so you can't separate them out in that kind of way. But what's really fascinating is that in living organisms, in our cells, in proteins, only left-handed amino acids are found. So even if you did collect a whole bunch of amino acids, you're going to get an equal 50-50 mix of right and left-handed. So to build a protein, you've got to select only left-handed ones. Now, some of the proteins consist of thousands of amino acids, but let's take a simple one. Let's say it was only 300 amino acids. Can you imagine tossing a coin 300 times and getting heads every time? That's the equivalent of picking just left-handed amino acids out of a naturally occurring mix somehow. Now, I don't know about you, but after about the first 3 or 4 heads in a row, I think I'd want to have a look at the coin, wouldn't you? Because you'd start to think, hang on a minute, this is getting a bit unlikely to do it 300 times, let alone thousands. No chance. I like this cartoon, and the scientist is sitting there with all his equipment and equations on the board and everything else, and he thinks to himself, if I can just synthesise life here, then I'll have proven that no intelligence was necessary to form it in the beginning. A bit tongue-in-cheek. Now, this next experiment is not something that I recommend you do. Any young people here? We have here a hapless tree frog which has jumped into a blender. So we just do it, you know, this is a mind exercise. Don't go finding frogs and putting them in your mother's blender, right? Now, if you're to run the blender, you're going to end up with frog soup, right? Now, in the blender, you will have all the DNA, the RNA, all the amino acids, proteins, everything that you need to make a frog. All the bits are there. So how long will you have to wait before a frog jumps back out of the blender? It's not going to happen, is it? You see, there's a problem, and that is, how do you assemble the bits? Even if Onnuri was right and you did get all the component parts, you have to put them together. Sir Fred Hoyle said this: the chance that higher life forms might have emerged this way, that is through a chance assemblage of chemicals, is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the material therein. So can you imagine that? A tornado comes through the junkyard and leaves behind it a fully operating jumbo jet. I mean, it's clear nonsense, isn't it? That cannot possibly happen by chance. But why not? So let's think about it. There's a concept called irreducible complexity. And a really good way to illustrate it is with a mousetrap. Now, a mousetrap works because it's got all the essential component parts and they're all assembled together. But until they are all assembled together, it's completely useless. So here we have the mousetrap with the hammer, the spring, the holding bar, the catch and the base, all assembled together. Now let's build our mousetrap, and we're going to leave one piece out. And I'm wondering if you can tell me what's missing from this mousetrap. What's missing? If you look at it closely, it's that little locking bar, isn't it? That's got to come from one end over and hold the catch up so it's fully loaded. Now, if you used that as a mousetrap, what would you get? Well, very fat and happy mice, right? They'd just be forever eating your cheese, but you wouldn't catch a thing. You have to put it all together. All the component parts have to be ready at once, otherwise it's useless. But you think about any biological system. Think about our eyes, for instance. We have to have a lens, an iris. We need to have eyelids that blink. We've got to have a retina. We need to have an optic nerve. We need to have a dedicated part of our brain which interprets the signals from the optic nerve. And before the entire system is put together, it's completely useless. The organism can see nothing. If you've got a nicely formed eye but no optic nerve, you'll be blind. If you've got the optic nerve but no part of your brain dedicated to interpreting it, you're blind. So until all the component parts are together, it won't work. So assembling things cannot be done in small incremental steps. Now Darwin recognised this, and he said if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Well, subsequent to Darwin, it's been demonstrated over and over and over again. In fact, I don't think there is any biological component or system in our bodies, or in any living organism for that matter, which can possibly be assembled by numerous successive slight modifications. A classic example which is often used is the bacterial flagellum. This is a whip-like structure of a bacterium, or ones which can move. They use it to propel themselves around. And it's a complicated little thing. It's like an outboard motor with this whip-like structure. And this little graphic gives you some idea as that motor whizzes around. So the thing produces this rippling kind of motion, and that propels it along. But what's even more amazing is not just the operation. By the way, you've got to have all the bits together before it will work, right? So a partly formed flagellum is of no use whatever. But what's even more amazing is how it is assembled. Now, under the programmed control of the DNA, proteins are manufactured inside the cell, the bacterium, and each of these different coloured component parts is a protein. It's a whole collection of amino acids. And you'll notice they're all different shapes, but they're carefully designed to fit together, and that actually is forming what's basically the electric motor which drives the flagellum. And then coming up from inside is this special tool which pierces the side of the bacterium, but without killing it. Now, one way you can kill bacteria is to pierce the outer surface of it, and that kills them. But this is done in such a clever way it does not kill it. Now you can see that special tool there was used to assemble that curved section. That's like a universal joint. And then this tool is assembled. It's a 5-pointed device, and it's used to take these coming proteins, which are all being made inside the cell in accordance with the instructions on the DNA, and they all interlock progressively, and it actually ends up being a 6-sided device. So that's why I've got that steady rotation happening. And this is all happening, and it then finally produces that flagellum, which combined with all the others means that that bacterium can now propel itself and do its job. But now all of that takes place inside. It's staggering. So the manufacturing process is, I think, even more incredibly complex than how it even operates. An extraordinary device. Well, Sir Fred Hoyle, again, the probability of the formation of just one of the proteins, and not all of those proteins, just one on which life depends, is comparable to the solar system. Now think about this. The solar system, think how big that is, packed full of blind people, randomly shuffling Rubik's cubes, and all arriving at the solution at the same time. How ridiculous would that be? Right? Totally impossible. No one in their right mind would entertain for a moment that it could happen by chance. And yet, for the evolutionists, they have to believe that it did. It's an article of faith. Somehow, we don't know how, but somehow it happened. And we know why we know it happened, because here we are talking about it. That's the kind of logic they use. But how much more logical is it to say such complexity must have come about by a designer? And they'll argue, well, okay, it's incredibly, incredibly unlikely. But guess what? We lucked out. That's why people invent things called multiverses. They try to create an infinite number of multiverses, so a massively improbable event eventually becomes effectively inevitable. And so they play games with probability and they say improbable events happen all the time. I mean, for instance, somebody wins the lottery, right? That's incredibly unlikely. But a winner is certain. Somebody wins. But if the same outcome was repeated again and again, if the same person won many times over, that's intelligent design. There was an interesting court case in the US some years ago, and the district clerk was responsible for putting the names of candidates on a ballot sheet. And over some decades, the same party's position, the name of that party, rather, was always first on the ballot sheet. Now, if you're at the top of the ballot sheet, you have a bias towards what's called the donkey vote, people who start at the top and go one all the way down and just don't care. So there's a higher probability that the person at the top is going to get elected. So this happened 40 times out of 41 elections. And anyway, somebody got a bit wise to this. Now think about that. The same party gets the top billing 40 times out of 41. Would you accept that as being a random ballot process? I wouldn't. And it went to court. And it was recognised that there was cheating going on. Okay, so let's come back to this. But what if there was no certainty of an outcome? You see, the lottery idea is actually a very bad example because not any old arrangement of amino acids will do to form life. You have to have a particular arrangement, and that is staggeringly improbable, and that speaks of intelligence. Well, here's Professor George Wald. He received the Nobel Prize, very smart bloke, and he said, given enough time, it will almost certainly happen at least once, it being life originating. Time is in fact the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. The possible becomes probable, and the probable virtually certain. One only has to wait. Time itself performs the miracles. Well, maybe that's the answer. We've got billions of years of evolutionary history, apparently, and here we are, we just lucked out. Well, let's do some mathematics. Who does maths here in the group? Anyone study mathematics? School? Yeah, I'm sure some of you do. Okay, just travel with me a bit on this and let's do some mathematical analysis of this problem. Okay, how much time have we got? Well, according to the evolutionists, we've got about 14 billion years, okay? There are about 10 to the 80th atoms in the universe. So scientists tell us. I've never counted them, I must confess. How many experiments are possible? Well, let's imagine that every single atom represents an experiment every single millisecond, so 1,000 times a second. Every one of the atoms in the entire universe represents an experiment. So how many experiments would we have in 14 billion years? Well, there it is. You can write all those numbers down and you multiply them. So I stuck it on my calculator and I came up with an error. That's because the number was too big. So I did it properly with a scientific calculator, and it turns out it was 4.4 times 10 to the 100th experiments would be possible in all of time. All right? Okay, so let's say we want to make an average protein. Let's say it's got 300 amino acids. Now, there are only 20 amino acids available. Actually, there are more than that, but let's say there's only 20 that appear in living systems. That they are optically pure. That means that they are all left-handed. Remember, I had only one hand, left-handed. And that they form bonds without enzymes. Now, they are massive concessions, all right? But let's assume those things. So, how many possibilities are there? There's 20 of them, and you need 300. So that's 20 to the power 300, which is 10 to the power 390. So that's a 1 followed by 390 zeros. I mean, it's just incomprehensible number. Now remember, there were 4.4 times 10 to the 100th possible experiments. So what's the probability we're going to get an answer? The chance of forming one protein is 4.4 times 10 to the minus 290. So all that means absolutely nothing, right? Because it's all too complicated. So let me express it this way. That is the same as guessing a 290-digit PIN in one shot. Now, I've got a credit card and it's protected with a 4-digit PIN. And or there's all sorts of, secondary methods of verification these days. But I'd be quite happy giving you my credit card and letting you have a shot at an ATM, because you've got one chance. Well, can someone tell me what's the probability of a 4-digit PIN of guessing it in one shot? Who are the mathematicians? The first guess, what's your chance? 1 in 10, isn't it? You've got to get the right digit. So the second guess is 1 in 10 again, isn't it? The third guess is 1 in 10. The fourth guess, 1 in 10. So that's 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. That's 1 in 10,000 is the chance you're going to get it in one shot. But this is 1 in 290. It's just ridiculously impossible. You could not even form one protein in the entire 14 billion years of evolutionary history. It's just not possible. No one with a reasonable mind would accept it. So back to George Wald. And he finally concedes. He says, one only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Hooray! He's got it. But then he goes on and says, yet here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. So he says it's impossible, and he says, but I believe it. Can you see the power of our belief? It makes us believe irrational things. It's like Alice in Wonderland, who had to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast or something, or whatever the story was. You see, it's absolute madness. I'm reminded of Romans 1:22 that says, professing to be wise, they became fools. Well, back in the middle 1800s, Louis Pasteur formulated what we now call the law of biogenesis, which is that life only originates from life. See, you can't get life through random processes. So, in interest of time, let me just move along a bit here. Now, part of this whole process of biological evolution is the claim that the fossil record shows a development from very simple organisms to more complex ones over millions and millions of years. You can see the time scale down the left-hand side. So-called simple organisms at the bottom and complex ones up the top. But Darwin recognised that there was a problem with the fossil record, and that is that it didn't show the intermediate stages that he expected to find. And he said, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection that can be urged against the theory. But he believed that as more and more fossils were found, that the intermediate stages showing the evolutionary progression would be found. So wind the clock forward, a couple of hundred years, no, not quite, 160-something years, and here we have Dr. Colin Patterson, who is a senior paleontologist, who wrote a book about fossils. Someone wrote to him about the book, and he wrote back and said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line, there is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. Now, isn't that an admission? Will you hear that in your science courses, your biology classes at university? No, you won't. The fossil record, it is claimed, gives evidence. Now, here's an interesting article that was published in Science Journal, and it was supposedly a standard article on the evolution of dinosaurs, and it purported to show the dinosaur family tree with all the different classes of dinosaur there at the top and all the different branches. Now, the solid lines represent actual fossil evidence, and the length of the line corresponds to a time scale, which is down the left-hand side. Now, I've just illustrated there in red and blue what are called the ghost linkages. And these are where there is no actual fossil record, but shows the relationships that the scientists believe exists between these. And this produces the dinosaur family tree, starting right at the bottom and then branching out in all these different ways. But if we take away the ghost linkages, what do we get? There's no tree. You see, the tree is an article of faith of the evolutionist. It actually doesn't exist in the evidence. There's no evidence to support the tree at all. In fact, I rather like this quotation. It says, "Now evolution is the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links not seen." Those of you who are familiar with Hebrews 11:1 might recognise a certain similarity there. So, what do we know about human evolution? And these are just some quotes that I think are interesting. These are honest moments from some scientists. "Unfortunately, the fossil evidence for human evolution is patchy. There has been a great deal of controversy over primate and human relationships. Over the past 15 years, almost every part of our story, every assumption about who our ancestors were and where they came from, has been called into question. We note that, like that of other hominins, the evolution of Homo is highly controversial." And it goes on, "The time at which the hominid line diverged from that of the African apes is controversial. When you look at the narrative for hominin bipedal apes, including modern humans, origins, it's just a big mess. There's no consensus whatsoever. New human fossil discovery has everyone questioning the origin of mankind." You see, they've got no idea, friends, they've got no idea. But that's not how it's projected in the popular science, in the TV documentaries, or in our classes. And you've all seen this classic icon of the origin of man, starting with the stooped ape and progressing upwards. My colleague, Scott Devlin, from our Brisbane office, has produced a short video clip that analyses this, and he does a great job. Let's have a listen to Scott.
You may recognise this image from school textbooks, t-shirts, soda adverts, and everything in between. But what if I were to tell you that if we're to be honest with the evidence that we have, this picture should look more like this? Let me explain. On the left is what is believed to be the first ape, known as proconsul, and on the right is a human called Homo sapiens. But what scientific evidence is there for everything else in this image? The transitional species. Let's find out. We'll start with Homo neanderthalensis. You might know him as Neanderthal man. Recent discoveries have shown that Neanderthal man made and wore jewellery, played instruments, used tools, and wore makeup. We've even found that his brain was the same or slightly larger than the average human living today. In other words, Neanderthal man was actually just a man. What about Homo erectus? Recent discoveries have shown that Homo erectus made tools, engaged in artwork, spoke intelligent language, and made and sailed boats. In other words, Homo erectus was also just a man. Now we'll come back to Homo habilis in a moment, but first, let me show you something. Have you ever heard of Lucy, the most famous so-called ape man, paraded in our museums, one of the very first Australopithecus afarensis species ever to be found? But what does the evidence reveal? She had a skull that was sloped and ape-like, nothing like human skulls. Fingers that were curved, not at all like human fingers. Toes that were curved, not at all like human toes. Wrists that had the ability to lock for knuckle walking, and a knee structure that was compatible with life in trees. So Lucy and her kind swung from trees and looked like today's apes. Lucy is an extinct type of ape. As we've just seen, Homo sapiens, Neanderthal man, and Homo erectus were all men. Australopithecus afarensis and proconsul were both apes. Considering the ubiquity of the evolutionary icon, we'd really want to see some strong evidence for Homo habilis, the pivotal point of transition between stooped ape and upright man, between basic instinct and intelligent thought, between animal noise and intelligent speech. The only problem is, in the words of Ian Tattersall, Homo habilis is a wastebasket taxon, little more than a convenient recipient for a motley assortment of hominin fossils. Other scientists referred to him as a garbage bag, because the bones we have for him are a mixture of human and ape bones. In other words, Homo habilis never existed. I think evolutionary professor Bernard Woods sums this up well. Our progress from ape to human looks so smooth, so tidy, it's such a beguiling image that even the experts are loath to let it go. But it is an illusion. With the lack of evidence and agreement on the ape-human transition forms, why is this not happening? Or this? And is a better explanation that man and apes have always coexisted and reproduced according to their own kind, as stated in Genesis 1.
So I think he does an excellent job of that, doesn't he? So I hope you can see the evidence just does not stack up. So this sort of picture that we see so often is actually probably best explained by the order in which things were buried during the flood of Noah. Now, I'm just going to wrap up. There's a whole bunch of things in this whole area of biology, that I could talk about. But I want to share with you some of the resources that are available. This is a new book that has only recently been released. In fact, we don't even have a slide for it made up yet, but it's just come out, called Biblical Biology 101. And we've got a few copies up there. I've had a quick glance at it, and what I see in there is really, really excellent. So, friends, I think I'll just wrap up at that point and just share with you one piece of very helpful advice, that Bible, we need to make the Bible the basis of our thinking in every area. But do you know what Bible actually stands for? Now, this might come as a surprise to you. It actually means basic instructions before leaving Earth. I'll let you think about that.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, somebody asked me if there will be a Q&A after this, and I said yes, but I'm afraid that we can't. So please write down your questions now, and we're going to have that answered after the night session. Yes, it's because the sessions upstairs, they've finished like almost an hour ago. And so we have like parents waiting to pick up their kids. So we have to wrap up now. Yes, so if you can't come tonight, we will share the link once we upload all the videos up in the YouTube channel. So please leave your numbers with me so I can send it to you. And if you come tonight, I will see you tonight. Can we start selling the books at 5:30 tonight? Because we thought people who want to buy books who are going to the Korean seminar, it's better that they come early and get the books and go to the seminar. Okay, so let's wrap up with prayer and close the session. Heavenly Father, you've given us your word. You've given us the full revelation of yourself in the Bible from the beginning. You've spoken to us, and you've shown the evidences, and you've given us instructions, and you've given us Jesus, the Word who became the flesh. Father, we confess that we might have treated Bible lightly, and we've treated other wisdom and knowledge of the world higher. But Lord, we now come back to your word that was given to us, and we want to rearrange and reform our understanding and mind according to your word and your promise in the Bible. So please help us to have that transformation in our worldview, our faith, and so we may experience a new way of seeing the world through the truth of the Word of God, and the true way, the only way to see the world and to live the world. Thank you again for this afternoon session, Lord, that you've given us so much that helps our faith and help us to deliver the good news of Jesus to our friends and family. Please help us to protect our knowledge, protect our faith, our spirit, until we see each other again tonight. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Thank you, guys. I will see you tonight.